1968. We were in first year high. Brash, squeaky, clean, full of ourselves. Intrepid because inexperienced. Unfaced because unchallenged. And in just 4 years, something happened which transformed us forever. This something was the world, and understandably enough, the Ateneo. And never since then has it loomed as large, nor sparkled as brightly, nor beckoned as irresistibly. The passive resistance of the middle 60s had now ripened into open dissension. Quiet protest had now matured into ideological radicalism. Molotov cocktails became the symbol of dissent. The city walls that were marred with the names of street gangs now bled radical slogans against government. The undeclared battle between a youth and establishment grew into a full-scale war. The psychedelic culture permeated every facet of society. Change was everywhere. Miniskirts became micro-minis. Wayward kids became hippies. The cinema was loaded with the erotica of bomba films. The first short and dark-skinned actress became a superstar. The first re-elected Filipino president was sworn into office. Man finally landed on the moon. And the first Filipina was crowned Universal Queen.
You have to understand, we faced no ward-proper villains and perfect heroes. No medals were to be given out. No bugles were blown. Reuter, Hogan, and Irwin were just names our teachers mentioned.
We stared at the great Ateneo alumni from across the chasm of age. No Ateneans looked back. To us, Ateneo's heroes were parents and grandparents. Not specially distinguished, but banal and familiar. We had to look for our heroes. We inherited the old cheers and had to memorize them.
Ready on the right, yay! Ready on the left, yay! Bricks, that's up! Iron, that's up! Ready, aim, fire, boom, boom.
The artillery yell, cheer, cheer, and go, both sounded dated and campy. After a few laughs, we willingly forgot them. What we didn't forget was the desire to question, to ask when we couldn't understand, to challenge when we couldn't agree.
What have you learned? What do you have now that you never had before? What do you know now that you never knew before?
We inherited Ateneo's dreams, and believing in these dreams, we wanted them to come true.
Ateneo was not impervious to the upheaval. The university was rocked with pickets and boycotts. The Atenean looked into himself and found himself un-Filipino. The guidance shifted from English to the vernacular. The language changed. At once, the students felt the need for cultivating the appreciation of things Filipino. In grade school, we were punished and fined for speaking in the dialect as Tagalog was then called. Now, we spoke it, lived it, and later, we were to dream in it. In response, the university installed Father Bernas in 1970 as first Filipino dean. The era saw the genesis of campus groups, campus figures, and campus heroes. There were Voltaire Garcia, Edgar Hopson, the NUSP, the Kasdiwa, and the Kabataang Makabayan. And there was Father Ortiz welcoming dissent. As if the youth uproar were not enough, nature joined in the hubbub by unleashing Typhoon Yuling, which blew off the roof of the chemistry building. Women discovered their power, and the women's liberation movement was born. While girls were burning bras in some parts of the world, their local counterparts displayed their growing strength by poaching on this exclusive enclave for boys, trickling into the Ateneo as cross-registrants in 1969. The influx would later convert the Ateneo into a co-educational school. For the first time in its 110 years of existence in 1969, Ateneo allowed girls to live in the residence halls.
In about a year, the Ateneo basketball team with Afable, Ross, Cleofas, Samson, Arnaiz, Morales, and the rest was to win the first of recent NCAA championships. We cheered and hooted, "Never say die," or "If it's green, flush it." A bonfire warmed us through the weeks which followed. On the whole, however, there were more important things.
The youth woke up and decided to shake the world awake. Or was it the other way around? Everywhere, there was a naive, intense questioning of values and mores. Hair grew. Trousers flared and faded into rugged blue. Wow, pare. Haircut and dress rules were abolished. And all around, music exploded. RJ and UW, the Beat Club and Antipolo, all emitting shock waves of impatient wonder, radiating the heat, sometimes tender, always raw, of the passion which is youth's sin and salvation.
We chose to explore the implications and consequences of our dreams. We turned bohemian like others before us. Sometimes, we recall the flower generation, the age of Aquarius, and our parents were not amused.
The world crawled over the sturdy walls of Katipunan. From Barangka, of the valley behind us, rose the sounds of pain and lack. Even the bohemian in us sat up and kept quiet. An old prayer found on the cover of our old and blue grade school notebooks returned. It was an old dream we fought for.
Dearest Lord, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve Thee as Thou deservest. To give and not to count the cost. To fight and not to heed the wounds. To toil and not to seek for rest. To labor and not to ask for reward. Save that of knowing I am doing Thy will. Amen.
It's not time to make a change.
And, like foolish children, we tried to make this dream come true, each in his own way. But all our ways drew us out of the Ateneo, out of the old corridors of slanting sunlight, out of the spell of books kindly and gold-edged into who now knows where, into utopia and nirvana, into Ayala and Mendiola, into the mountains, into the inner cities of Tondo. We left the safe and changing world of Euclid and Plato and headed straight for misunderstanding and confrontation.
Once more, our parents were not amused.
For us, they seemed not to understand. Today, we see that maybe we didn't either. To speak of the late 60s and the early 70s as a period of turmoil has become cliché now. Likewise is denouncing it as those perilous times which endangered the life of the nation. Perilous times? Yes, but growth is always dangerous. True, activism and agitation for a new nation infected the previously pristine and aloof ivory towers of the universities. True, the nonconformity of the flower children jangled the nerves of parents and administrators alike. But it certainly wasn't a cliché for us then. For just as certainly, the only permanent thing in life is change. We believed in love and peace.
We believed in justice and brotherhood.
And sincerely, we believed that no one else did. After having abolished the haircut rule, after class nights were disallowed forever because of so many goings-on, after boycotts and marches and teach-ins and parties where no one danced, after long lunch hours where the air was sweet with smoke and friends would flit from classroom to classroom, jamming and playing Chethrutil or Crosby, Stills and Nash, after Sausawan and Child of Morning, our high school graduation ceremonies had to be different.
Our valedictorian spoke to us alone. His speech was like us, brash, irreverent, full of ourselves. Names only we recognized were dropped from his lectern. We loved the speech, but no one else did. Our parents couldn't understand. The high school officials were embarrassed. The rector scolded us. No one remembered what he said. No one was listening. Even before the formalities were over, we were cheering, laughing, and shouting, proud of having dreamt what we dreamt as we filed out.
A few months after that, the dreams were over.
"1972 shall be remembered as the end of one era and the beginning of another. Martial law descended upon us with a forbidding silence that was a sharp contrast to the din and tumult of the previous era. Metro aid smothered the city walls with alabaster to hide the last vestiges of protest. Almost everything in society retracted. Almost everything charted a course opposite its previous direction. Ateneo retracted from its radicalism but dwelt on the more immediate issue of Filipinization. A new Filipino department was created. Stage plays were mounted in Filipino. Filipino lost the stigma that it earned in the 50s. In 1973, Ateneo sold its 4-hectare Faura land. The country indulged in festivities of a grand scale. The Miss Universe pageant, the Thrilla in Manila, the Van Cliburn concerts. Ateneo was not without its similar frivolities. There was a search for Binibining Ateneo, a campus quest for the female Atenean pulchritude and talent.
It was 1973. We found the gates closed to our past. It was time to begin all over again. We were handed a totally new world.
We've only just begun.
For the Ateneo of that time, the greatest upheaval, the greatest revolution was the arrival of the ladies. Discussions and convocations, some formal, some totally unplanned, were held under the trees or inside the auditorium by the last exclusive generation of male Ateneans. Some would ask,
"What about tradition? What about our reputation? What about the distractions?"
As in many issues during that time, the student had little say in the matter. Registration week henceforth would open to skirts and trousers, to pinks and blues. Girls from SDC, Marinol, St. Skull, Philippine Science, Assumption, UP, started to tiptoe through the once sacred corridors of masculine excellence. There were beauty queens and brains, social butterflies, and hardened activists.
Ikaw ang Miss Universe ng buhay ko.
Instead of Fred and Isko, there were Yvettes and Patricias and Tinas and Lisas.
And on and on and on.
After several years, candidates for valedictorian would be named Achut and Fe and Cory and Chichi.
Who remembers the males?
By then, of course, only the most insecure males minded. Still, at first, things weren't always convenient.
Meanwhile, the world staggered under the impact of an oil crisis. Gasoline prices became 3 pesos a liter, and Ateneo responded with a hitch-a-ride program in the campus. 1972 to 1977 offered us the images of Kermit and Miss Piggy, of Farah Fawcett Majors and Alma Moreno, Times Journal, Bulletin Today, the Vietnam Pullout and Watergate, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, long skirts and flare pants.
Adjustments had to be made. We learned to dance inside the IAC room of Costco Hall. And yes, compete for the same elective positions.
Well, what's What's wrong with wanting to be IAC representative?
We were, after all Ateneans, Atenistas, and after a week of doing relief work for farmers half drowned by Yoling, we were friends. When the last giggle over co-education disappeared, we found that there was a whole student's life to be rebuilt. Some of our teachers were gone. Some were in prison, somewhere else. No school publications existed. Who knows how many other activities were lost?
Slowly, a handful of students started talking about reviving the Gaidan. And another handful, under Mr. Orlando Tino's tutelage, resuscitated the Heights, which was once upon a time called Pugadlawin, which was once upon a time called Heights. Still others joined Tanghalang Ateneo performances in the cafeteria.
We had to be pragmatic now. The shouting, the posturing, the grandiose and romantic gestures of earlier times were over. The discotheques that were held in the privacy of one's house in the 60s became the commercial disco. The strobe lights taking the place of candles and mosquito coils. Back home, there was cause for rejoicing. The Blue Eagles recovered the NCAA crown in 1975 after 6 years of lackluster basketball performance. It was a year of the double-double, a harvest of junior and senior crowns for both basketball and volleyball.
In our time, after Yoling cut light and life away from many in Central Luzon, some of us met and decided to do something more than relief work. There was none of the old Ateneo funfair, but the world still beckoned.
Yes, some dreams were not forgotten.
Yes, it beckoned when we talked to farmers and jeepney drivers and busboys in the Tagalog we were once trained not to speak. And we answered with one word, sarili ka, which really meant to work, to talk, to learn, and yes, to suffer with people outside the city. Hindi lahat ay nakaunawa. Iba-iba na kami. Wala na yung dating pagkabuklod.
It was as if it had never existed. 1977 to 1982 pushed the frontiers of the human mind to areas heretofore unimaginable. Electronics have invaded society, and the university was not spared. In 1979, Ateneo launched its computer operations, ushering education to the threshold of the computer age. The dark side of humanity has reached unimaginable depths. Confusion of the previous age rapidly matured into terrorism and mayhem. The past 5 years showed an epoch gone berserk, a world in badly need of therapy. The images have changed in so short a time. The Iran hostage crisis, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the emergence of nymphets as sexual commodities, Pepsi Paloma, Dewey D, the Jonestown Massacre, John Hinckley, Gerard Peter. But the young are not in short supply of idols. Rolando Navarrete, Lida de Vega, Gabby Concepcion, and Sharon Cuneta, Crispa and Toyota, Bo Derek and Brooke Shields, Superman and E.T., and Pac-Man. There are Game & Watch, Atari, Apple home computers, and Betamax. In this present world, so different from what we used to know, how much of the old Ateneo remains? The white long-sleeved uniform is there no longer. Students come to class in t-shirts, blue jeans, and rubber shoes, or any outfit they fancy. A residue of the freedom fought for in the late 60s. The sight of a woman no longer excites the Ateneans the way it used to in our days. The Arneo accent is dead. The Christmas package drive has ceased. The Sanctuary Society is gone. We have left the NCAA to join UAAP, and some old familiar faces are gone. Father Eliazo, Father Irwin, Father Culligan, Father Dowd, and Father De La Costa.
We're in the 80s now. The dancing, the first intoxication with freedom, the first infatuation with art and life, are over. We look around and are left with dreams.
Each generation creates its own memories. We go back to the Ateneo, not expecting much of the past preserved and repeated in time, but to realize how much change made it worthy of sweet recollection.